History can be found anywhere, even in your own backyard. So join us as we search the land, looking for the stories that helped shape this nation. Come on the porch, grab a drink, and join us for a little bit of history from the homestead. Hello, everybody, and welcome to the History from the Homestead podcast. I am your host, Thomas Carroll, and please join me today as we welcome the wonderful Elizabeth Shope. She is a park ranger at the Allegheny Portage Railroad National Historic Site and the Johnstown Flood National Memorial. She has been with the park since 2014 and has a background in American Studies. So, hello, Elizabeth. Thanks for joining us.
Hi, Tom. Thanks for having us.
So this is an extra special one because today happens to be, we're recording and releasing today in one shot. It's the 189th anniversary of the railroad's opening.
Yes. So the Allegheny Portage Railroad opens March 18th, 1834. And so it's, as you said, the 189th anniversary of the opening of the railroad. And this system was part of the Pennsylvania Mainline Canal, and the Allegheny Portage Railroad was the final link to the Pennsylvania Mainline Canal. And it's interesting how they got to that point. Railroads were very much in their infancy in America at that time, and canals were the preferred method of travel. So they thought about a few different ways to get over the Allegheny Mountains, one of those being a turnpike road. There was already one of those in the area, and that didn't help solve the state's goal. The goal of the state of Pennsylvania for the Pennsylvania Mainline Canal was to move people and goods faster. In New York State, you have the Erie Canal, and people are bypassing the port city of Philadelphia because it takes so long to get across the state, about 3 weeks by wagon. They talked about digging a canal through the mountains, but one estimate said it could take 30 years until it would be ready. So there's almost a sense of urgency because the rest of the mainline canal is about ready to go, and we need to figure out how to get over the Allegheny Mountains. So this final link was a great day for the state, because now you could travel continuously from Philadelphia to Pittsburgh.
Yeah.
And the train cars were carrying a very important item, and that was bacon.
Ooh, bacon. Everybody loves bacon. And it's to me, as far as national parks goes, it's not big. When you think of national parks, you think Yellowstone. But to me, it's one of the more unique parks because you have everything in the area: canal, railroad, inclined plains. It's quite a marvel for its day how they got up and over the mountain.
Yes, it was an engineering marvel of its day. It's always amazing to me to think about what they did, in the 1830s with the tools that they had available to them at that time. So, hand tools, a lot of hard work. I always say it's one thing to say, this is a way to get over the Allegheny Mountains. We're going to use an inclined plane railroad, but to actually build it and make it function is amazing.
Yeah. And our guide for the show, we're kind of following along like the actual path from Philadelphia towards Pittsburgh. So we'll start off with the canal. And that ran from Columbia, PA, which is just west of Philly, clear to Hollidaysburg. That's quite a trip on a canal boat.
It is. So the entire trip from Philadelphia to Pittsburgh was almost 400 miles. There were two parts railroad, the Allegheny Portage Railroad being one, and then a stretch of railroad section in Philadelphia. And the whole thing took about an average of 5 days to go across the state. And that was the fast new way to travel at that time. I mentioned earlier, it took about 3 weeks by wagon. So people were really excited about the
Yeah.
main canal, and I think of people who had traveled through Pennsylvania previously. There's an account of people talking about, we we went through Pennsylvania. It was very long. It took 3 weeks. And then when they made a return trip back through Pennsylvania, now it only took 5 days. So if you were traveling at that time where, it wasn't complete when you were going across the state west, and now it's complete when you're coming back east. I mean, that must have been really,
That's dumb, yeah.
really amazing.
And how the canal boats, how big were these on average? They weren't exactly small. They weren't like your little pleasure boats.
Yeah, so like 19th century canal boats, 50 to 70 feet long, you know, filled to, I don't know if capacity is the right word, but they definitely tried to, you know, make the most out of the space in the canal boats. And, it's a,
Yeah.
money making operation too. So we want to, put as many people, fit as many people as we can on the boat for the trip. So it costs about $12 to travel across the state from Philadelphia to Pittsburgh. So
Which to us that doesn't sound like a ton, but to them that was an
right, yeah,
average worker's several months' wage at least.
right, and some of the laborers on the Portage Railroad, making up dollar 50 a day. So that, well,
Yeah.
yeah, the $12 is could be quite
And that,
expensive.
now how did they move the boats along the canal? Were they like the other ones? Did they use horses and stuff?
Yeah, they use the mules being pulled along the canal towpath.
Which that's even just impressive to think about because then you had to clear any trees and brush away from the side of canal for you said about 400 miles worth of canal trip.
Yeah, the whole mainline canal, about 400 miles. But yes, I mean, just in how many teams of animals you would need. You can't have the same mule
Yeah.
going, the whole way. So stopping to rest, switching them out. So yeah. But I think for the people traveling, there are accounts of, people just talking about how beautiful Pennsylvania was, just the scenery. I mean, I think I would love to go back and
It
experience,
it would be
a lot
fun,
of
yeah.
these little towns before they really grew up. And a lot of these towns did, population boom because of the mainline canal, this big transportation system coming through where they live. So, lots of jobs available. Um, so
And that makes a good point because my next question I was going to ask was did the boats did they have sleeping areas on them or did the passengers stay at like hotels or boarding houses or what have you along the path?
yeah, so they did have sleeping arrangements on the canal. Typically, that was a plank board that was attached to a wall. Um, so Charles Dickens is, perhaps the most famous Allegheny Portage Railroad traveler, and he wrote an account of his travels in a book called American Notes. His first trip to America was in 1842. He traveled on the railroad and the canal, and he actually talks about the plank boards and kind of like rolling himself into onto the board. And he's looking up and he sees a board above where he's laying, and he sort of looks at how they're attached to the wall, and it's not a substantial method of attaching those. And so he writes about how disappointed his family would be if the person above him were to fall on him during the middle of the night. So yes, the sleeping arrangements were were that, and then it's, it's a sort of a bunch of people in a room, all, sleeping on board. So, I'm sure, people snoring, and I'm sure it wasn't always a good night's sleep.
Probably, probably not. Yes, I'm. Other than that, how would the conditions have been? I mean, it's primitive compared to our standards for sure, but and I've been up to the national park there itself. You have about a quarter of a canal boat built there as a replica you can get and see, which is plain, but it doesn't seem terrible. Minus it doesn't have air conditioning and heat and everything like we enjoy so well today.
Yes. Yeah, so we do have a replica of a canal boat in our visitor center, um, showing what, the crew would have been staying in. But yeah, so a lot of people that write about traveling on the canal, one thing that a lot of people didn't like about it was sharing close space with people that they didn't know for days on end. So canal travel could be quite cramped. Um, so a lot of people um, pointed pointed that out. So things like shared space, accounts sort of like washing your face off in the morning with some canal water, and the shared comb to for your hair, um, things like that. But yeah, a lot of people, and I think because you're traveling with the same people for periods of time, we always say that taverns and towns were welcome sites on the canal, because it was a chance to stretch out a bit, have some space. If you and I are traveling together on the canal, especially at that time, of course, no TVs and phones and things. So I know as much about what's going on as you do. So it's a nice opportunity to catch up on the news of the day, talk to other people, find out what's happening, and also I think sharing stories. This was a unique system. Most people had never, especially the Portage Railroad, they'd never been on something like that. So, if I'm, I haven't been through the Staple Bend Tunnel yet, I'm heading to Johnstown, you're heading to Hollidaysburg, I'm talking to you at the summit, hey, what was it like to go through the Staple Bend Tunnel? I've never been through a tunnel before. So just sharing those experiences. So yeah, I think travel on the Portage Railroad was a mixture of excitement and apprehension.
I have no doubt. And I mentioned the visitor center, and I recommend anybody goes sees that. There'll be a link for it on our website as well, because it's a really nice place. There's a lot of room to walk around. So, but that brings us to the next part. Now we've got to the end of the canal. Now we have to start up the mountain on the inclined planes, and there were quite a few of them. I forget exactly how many now that there were overall, but there were quite a few inclined planes.
Yeah, so there were 10 incline planes and 11 levels. So the Allegheny Portage Railroad connected two canal basins, Hollidaysburg and Johnstown. So Allegheny Portage Railroad was about 36 miles.
Yeah, and now they just took, if I'm not mistaken, they loaded the canal boats themselves pretty much onto railroad flat cars, and they pulled boats and everything up the incline and down the other side, correct?
Yes, yes. So when you got to the canal basin and you were going to start on the Allegheny Portage Railroad, they had tracks that actually went down into the water, and they used something called a boat slip, just get the boat onto the flatbed cars. They also use stationary steam engines. So you can almost I guess compare that to like a how you would get a boat out of the water today, sort of up onto a trailer, kind of, you back the trailer down close to the water and, get the boat up on that.
Yeah.
So yeah, everything that came into the canal basin, went up over the mountains and then back into the water on the other side.
Wow. And those steam engines, which there's also one of those at the visitor center, they're giant. They are not small.
Yes, yes. So for the first year that the Allegheny Portage Railroad opened in 1834, they didn't use any locomotives. So for the Allegheny Portage Railroad on the inclined planes, locomotives didn't have enough power to go up over the mountains like they do today. So you needed those 10 inclined planes. And how it worked was you had a stationary steam engine housed in an engine house building at the top of each inclined plane. So there would have been 10 engine house buildings made of wood and housed all of the machinery needed to pull everything up the inclined planes. So for the first year that the railroad opens, on the level sections, they just used horses. In 1835, they started the incorporation of steam locomotives on the level section. So on the inclined planes, it's still those stationary engines, but on the levels, they're flat. So steam locomotives are able to pull along those sections. So it wasn't everywhere and it wasn't all at once. So you have the Boston locomotive made in Boston, and it goes back and forth on one particular level. Then maybe the next year you get another few. So it was a slow incorporation. Also, the first year that the railroad opened, it was sorry.
And these steam locomotives, when you think about steam locomotives, everybody thinks about the giants that they have. These weren't big. I mean, they were big compared to, your car, but they were not big. They were not as powerful, and they weren't streamlined. They were, in a way, kind of even ugly looking, but they did the trick.
They did do the trick. You know, you're moving at about 4 miles an hour up the incline planes with a stationary engine, and then on the level sections, 15 miles an hour, which of course to us today seems slow, but 15 miles an hour. Ulysses S. Grant is another famous Allegheny Portage Railroad traveler, and he traveled in 1839. He was 17 years old on his way to West Point, and he said that they were traveling so fast it was like annihilating space. Again, that seems slow to us today. And I actually met a family a few years ago who had an account of ancestors of theirs that traveled on the railroad, and a very similar story. They said that, I'm sort of paraphrasing here, but the account was saying about how they were traveling so fast that you couldn't make out the individual trees as you were going past. It was like they all blurred together. So yeah, and people were excited because it took 6 hours or more to go over the Allegheny Mountains on the Portage Railroad. So hey, only 6 hours to go 36 miles. That's great.
That's not bad. I mean, you could be walking it the whole time.
Yeah. And the Portage Railroad only operated during the daylight hours, especially until, the 1850s. But so you had to leave Hollidaysburg or Johnstown, around a certain point in the morning to make sure that you made it over the mountains by nightfall. If not, you kind of stopped when it got dark, and you were there. You were there until it got light again. But they tried to make sure that didn't happen.
And now the hoist engine specifically to hoist the cars and everything up each incline. How many people were needed to run each one of those engines?
So the engines, you had an engineer and an assistant engineer who ran those. But then at the engine house buildings, you also had other workers besides the ones dealing with, maintaining those stationary engines. You had firemen who controlled the boilers, shoveled coal. You had folks at the base of the inclined planes that hooked everything up to the hemp rope and then later the wire cable. So you had a few different jobs at the inclined planes. You had laborers as well who, tended to the animals, things like that. So your higher paying jobs at the engine house were your engineer and your assistant engineer.
Yeah. Now the burning question is, I think I know, but the steam hoist engines for the inclined planes, how did they get them up there to begin with? One piece at a time, basically, and build them on site? Because, like I said,
Yeah, they would have
they're
to be
massive.
transported up, and yeah, I mean, a lot of that machinery is would have been very big. So yeah, yeah, I mean, just getting everything there, and I mean, sort of the sort of different from what you just asked, but it reminded me of one of the locomotives that came into a canal basin. They're in a newspaper account about, people being there to see it. So just to see this system in
Yeah.
operation and the amazing things that took place were.
That yeah, that would be so cool to see, because those those steam hoist engines, like the winch drum, I mean, it's got to be 15 probably feet across. That's how big these are. Massive, massive steam engines. They're not.
Yeah, and,
Did
and what we have at the park that you're referring to is we call it Engine House 6 exhibit shelter. So the original engine house wooden building fell down sometime in the early 1900s, and if you walk inside today you can see some of the stone foundation, but a local gentleman who lived in Crescent, his name was Fred Conacher, he built all of that to scale based on Sylvester Welch's his writings. He was the engineer for the Allegheny Portage Railroad, and it's amazing.
it is now? We'll go back to the locomotives too, since we're kind of back and forth, but that's fine. Now, like on the levels with the steam locomotives, how many cars would they typically pull? I'm sure just a couple.
Yeah, a lot of it went by weight. So they pulled, probably maximum about 7,000 pounds, 6,500 to 7,000.
And they use some like passenger cars as well, I believe.
Yes. So they had freight cars and they also had passenger cars. Yeah. So they
And
had both.
there's another one. We think about the passenger cars that we see now, or even the old ones like the big Pullmans. These were not that.
Right. It's interesting because if you look at a photo of a freight car and a passenger car, um, they look very similar, except for the passenger car has windows. So,
Yeah.
right. Not like every person has a seat today. The earliest ones, you like we're facing each other with our backs against the wall. So
Almost like a trolley, sort of.
yeah, yeah. Yeah, sort of like a seating arrangement. Yeah, in terms of like a seating arrangement.
Yeah, I've seen pictures of them. They're not like what you'd see.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, it almost just looks like a, a box with a window.
Somebody just took a box car and what do we do? I just cut some windows in it and put some benches in. We'll be good. So now on the levels where the locomotives ran, did they turn them around any? Did they have round tables or anything, or did they just run them forwards or backwards?
Yeah, they did turnarounds. They had Y switches, and then they had the turnarounds as well.
And for anybody that wonders what a Y switch is, The easiest way I can describe it is just think about doing a 3-point turnaround in your car. Pull up, back up, and pull up and go.
Right, right. You're going on the same track,
So
just in the opposite direction.
yeah. Um. So now we're along the railroad. We have also, you mentioned it earlier, the Staple Bend Tunnel, which, if I'm not mistaken, is the first railroad tunnel in America. First
Yes.
one built.
First railroad tunnel in America. There were a few tunnels at that time for canals, but this was the first railroad tunnel. And people didn't weren't really familiar with tunnels, and they described it as a horizontal well. And Staple Bend Tunnel is 901 feet long. So earlier when I mentioned the excitement and apprehension, and I imagine never experiencing that before. 901 feet of darkness. So that would have been quite the experience. The
Yeah.
first time you go through a tunnel. So and that would have been closer to the Johnstown end of where the railroad was. If you were traveling from the Canal Basin in Johnstown, it was a couple miles until you got to the Staple Bend Tunnel. So it was right at the top of the first inclined plane.
Okay. And it's a beautiful, the portal on it and everything is beautiful.
It
It's
is. It is. About half of the cost to build the Staple Bend Tunnel was actually for those portals and the ornamentation on the end on each end.
and how did you get the name the Staple Bend Tunnel? I was curious about that. I honestly tried to look it up and could not find anything on why.
Yeah, so it refers to the word staple as a farm instrument. So a staple was an apparatus that went around the neck of livestock to help steer them
Oh,
in the right direction. And so folks thought that the oxbow or the bend in the river resembled a staple.
interesting. Well, look at
Yeah.
that. There, I didn't even know that. And thinking about playing name, like we have portage. You think about it, it's the Allegheny Portage. And
Mm-hmm.
anybody that's familiar with the area knows of the town of Portage, but Portage actually means something different here. It's not named after the town, it has an actual description for Portage.
Yeah, so you're carrying people or goods between two bodies of water, or water on each end, and you're going up and over.
Right. And in which the town of Portage was along the railroad and is what, just a couple miles from Stapleton Tunnel. It's the same general area.
Yeah, so it's not too far traveling Allegheny Portage Railroad wise. It was what was called the long level, which was a little over 13 miles. So yeah, from Portage to the Staple Bend Tunnel was part of the long level. So it went through where Portage is today, but that town of Portage with the name of Portage as today came a little bit later. But yeah, went right through there, and that's a great point because people often ask, in terms of today, where did the railroad go? And a portion of it follows Route 53 through Lilly and Portage to Wilmore, down to Summerhill. Not exactly on 53
Yeah.
the whole way, but a lot of it would was where current present day Route 53 is.
Yeah. And anybody, knows it's Norfolk Southern now that goes through. Even a lot of that follows along. It just, they, they shot off to the side through Crescent and with the mainline railroad afterwards around Horseshoe Curve, and then eventually put the Portage Railroad out of business basically then when they.
Right, right. So, Horseshoe Curve is complete in 1854. And while the Mainline Canal was a great time reduction in terms of getting across the state. Now it can be done in one day. So
Yeah.
I often think about the people living here during that time. You go from 3 weeks prior to the opening of the Allegheny Portage Railroad, just because you can't, go the whole way across until the Portage Railroad's open, to, about an average of 5 days in 1834, and then in 1854, one day. So in about a 20-year time period, you're going from 3 weeks to one day. I mean,
Yeah.
that's amazing how fast things changed in terms of just technology in general, but railroad technology.
Right.
You
And
think
it,
it would have been mind blowing? It would have been hard to
oh
keep up
my
with
goodness.
how fast things changed.
My goodness. Yeah, I even think about now, heck, we can just hop on an airplane and go across the country in
Right,
less
right.
time than it took to
Yes.
get over the mountain, really.
Yes, yes. We always found a faster way to get from one place to
Hmm.
another.
So now we found our way over, so we are headed down, into Johnstown, which Johnstown became eventually a giant steel city. But how big was Johnstown about the time? I don't believe it was a very big city.
It wasn't very big. It definitely Johnstown and Hollidaysburg both had a population boom with the canal basins there. You have a lot of um, canal buildings and lots of different employment opportunities. So yeah, Johnstown started to see some significant growth with the mainline canal. And yeah, then like you mentioned, I mean, steel industry, I mean, it just grew and grew and grew. And yeah.
Which we're gonna hear more about that in the second part when we talk
Mhm.
more about Johnstown itself. But and then from Johnstown, it was all canal to Pittsburgh, correct? Or
Right.
was there
Yes. Yes. Once you got into the water in Johnstown, you traveled by canal from there to Pittsburgh.
now what they had some problems in Johnstown with the sufficient water flow, especially, which they still do. They tend to get very shallow. So what did the railroad do to help raise the water level, especially in the summer when it was much lower?
So the state of Pennsylvania built what they called the Western Reservoir, um, near the town of present day South Fork. And as you had mentioned, yes, during the summertime, there wasn't always enough water in the canal basin to float the canal boats. And um, just going to backtrack for 1 second and just mention that the mainline canal was a seasonal operation. So every year at some point it would close down. And in the Allegheny Mountains, sometimes, winter starts early and can last longer. So, when you looked ahead at the weather and it looked like the canals could freeze, they made the decision to close down. And once you made that decision, that was it until the spring thaw. So for many months every year, operations ceased. So you also didn't then want to have a delay in travel in the summertime. You have a certain operating window where the weather is nice. And so they built the Western Reservoir to supply water to the canal basin in Johnstown. They also had an Eastern Reservoir in the eastern side of the Allegheny Mountains that would supply water to Hollidaysburg's canal basin. So that definitely helped to keep operations continuing throughout the dry summer months. So with the Western Reservoir, the water would follow the Little Conemaugh River from South Fork to Johnstown.
Right. I was just gonna that was gonna be towards my second question because you can't change geography much when you're approaching the mountain going either way. You're going upriver, and they're getting inherently smaller as you get there. That's just the nature of it. And I didn't know they had a reservoir on the other side.
Yes, yes, they had one on each side.
Is it still there as well on the Hollidaysburg side?
I don't believe so.
Okay, I honestly didn't even pop into my head to look for that. I'm just familiar with what we had at South Fork, and I never thought of it because if you think about it too, it's an interesting fact that mountain is actually the part of the Eastern Continental Divide, because everything on the western side flows to the Mississippi and the Gulf. Everything on the other side goes to the Atlantic, usually through the Chesapeake Bay too.
Yeah,
So
the
it's a little
the
interesting.
divide is definitely isn't very far from here.
In fact, I remember reading somewhere that there was or used to be houses on top of the mountain that one side of the roof went to the
Mm.
Atlantic, the other side of the roof went to the Gulf of Mexico.
Yes, I read that somewhere as well. Yes.
And now, how big was the reservoir? We know it is, or knew it as Lake Conemaugh.
Yeah, it
Like,
had many different names. The state called it the Western Reservoir or the 3 Mile Dam. So it was about a little over 2.5 miles long. Um, Across widest spot was about a mile. Um, if you were to walk, from the top of the dam the whole way around back to the same spot, it was about 5 miles. So it covered
wow,
about 450 acres.
wow, that's
So quite
sizable. And
large.
which that's another one. We're gonna get into that one here in the second part of this, which I want everybody to know. We're doing this in two parts. They're gonna be, as far as I'm concerned, two separate episodes, but they're both related to each other. So I that's gonna bring us to about the end of our part about the Allegheny Portage Railroad. Before we go, what can anybody do to help the national parks as far as volunteering or how they can do that? What do you have for that?
Yeah. Thank you for mentioning that. Yes, we do have a volunteer program. We welcome anyone who would like to volunteer for Allegheny Portage Railroad National Historic Site or Johnstown Flood National Memorial. Many different volunteer opportunities, from talking to visitors inside the visitor center, or in one of our park buildings, or at Allegheny Portage Railroad. Our volunteer coordinator last year started a trail crew. So if you like being outside, working on the trail, they helped on the incline 6 to 10 trail last year. They blazed the trail, trash removal, cutting the trail back in places, opening the trail up, with vegetation growth. So we are currently recruiting volunteers to join our trail crew for this season. So they'll be again working on the incline 6 to 10 trail, but also on the Staple Bend Tunnel Trail as well. So if you're looking for more information on how to volunteer, you can visit our volunteer page on either website. It has a link to join the volunteer trail crew, other volunteer opportunities. So there'll be some upcoming ones that we'll be posting on there, some more ones too. So that's the best way to see current opportunities. So we definitely welcome any volunteers, and volunteers are a huge part of what we're able to do here. So they definitely help out tremendously.
And that's great because it's so important that we save a hold of all this history. That's why I wanted to start doing this. Thanks to everybody for listening. Remember, if you like the show, you can share it with all your friends. We can be found on all the major podcast players. We can be found on Facebook, and you can also find us and catch the show notes at historyfromthehomestead.com.